Marhaba. Welcome to our third Poetry and Prose event of the year. We are delighted this evening to have with us Dr. William Granara, and he likes to go by Bell. His presentation for tonight is about Ibn Hamdis, and is titled Ibn Hamdis, the Sicilian Poet, Reflection on Lost Youth and Usurped Homeland. Dr. Granara is a Gordon Gray Professor of Arabic in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Literatures and the Department of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. He is also the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Dr. Granara specializes in the history and cultures of Muslim Mediterranean. He writes on cross-cultural encounters between Islam and Christendom throughout Middle Ages. He is author of Narrative Muslim Sicily, War and Peace in the Medieval Mediterranean World. His second monograph, titled Ibn Hamdis, the Sicilian, Eulogies for a Fallen Homeland. And this is the book. We have it in our library. And you can check it out from Sultan Qaboos Culture Center Library. And we're gonna provide two links. One to check out the book, and another one to purchase the book from Amazon. You'll find the links in the chat box. We will have a Q&A session at the end. We'll start at about 6:50. In the meanwhile, you can write your questions in the chat box, and I will go over them when it's time for Q&A. And now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Granara to take it from here.
Thank you, Abir. First, let me start by thanking the Sultan of Qaboos Cultural Center, and especially a round of applause and thanks to Abir al-Muhsin, who extended the invitation to me and to all the members of her staff. I have fond memories of my 2 visits to the Sultanate of Oman, a most exquisite country, and it often made me think about all those pre-Islamic poems that I've read when I was in graduate school at the time. So that was the mothership, if you'd like, of Arabic poetry. Today, I'm going to present a poem by al-Jabbar Ibn Hamdis, who, being an Italian and American, he's somewhat akin to me. He was born in the city of Syracuse in the island of Sicily in the year 1055, and he died somewhere in North Africa. We have the historians are quite at odds as to where he actually died in 1133. He lived a long life of 80 years. At the age of 24, he chose to leave his homeland, and I emphasize the word chose, which will haunt him for the rest of his life. He chose to leave his homeland during a period of fierce political divisions among the warlords of Sicily, the Muslim warlords, and at a time at the beginning of the Norman conquests of Sicily as part of the Christian conquest or reconquest in Spain and Sicily at that time. He settled his family in the city of Sfax, which is now in southern Tunisia. And within a year, he found himself invited at the court of al-Mu'tamid ibn Abad of Seville, where he spent 13 years of his life. He stayed there until 1091, when the kingdom of Seville was ravaged by the fundamentalist Almoravids. Ibn Hamdis was forced into a second exile, along with the king and whoever remained of his royal entourage. Ironically, the year 1091 was the year in which the last bastions of Muslim Sicily in the towns of Noto and Castrogiovanni, or today Enna, finally fell to the Normans as well. Ibn Hamdis returned to North Africa, where he roamed the petty courts, if you'd like, in Ifriqiya, the central part of North Africa, and he spent the last 40 years, or the second 40 years of his life, as a court panegyric, during which he took every occasion to lament and bemoan, if you'd like, the loss of his beloved Muslim Sicily. He's left with us a Diwan. There are 2 manuscripts, one in the Vatican and one in St. Petersburg. that contain about 370 poems, maybe something like 5,000 lines, that range from 2-line qittas, or 2-line poems, to long qasidas. The diversity of the genres in his Diwan are the panegyric, the elegy, love poems, devotional poems, wine songs, description poems that show a remarkable diversity of his diversity and artistic versatility. The poem that I'm chose to present today is a poem which is considered to be one of the finest of his Siqilliyat. That was a term that was used by both medieval Arabic philologists and anthologists and modern Italian Orientalists who were the first to write about him in the West. The Siqilliyat are those verses, whether whole poems or parts of poems, in which he talks about his beloved Sicily. So for his long life, mostly in exile, the island of Sicily as his homeland, as his watan, is described with a lot of mixed emotions. This poem is 37 lines. It's numbered 110 in the Diwan, and I'll send a PDF of that copy to the Cultural Center, and you can get it from there. But it's untitled. But the poem has 3 decipherable parts, 3 movements, or 3 aghrad. Aghrad, as the Arabs would call them, 3 segments of the poem. The first is a gnomic introduction, or a muqaddama hikamiyya. The second is a wine song, a khamriya. And the third is something in the way of a dua, or something like the lamentation of his lost, paradise lost. The first section can be read quite generically, with a poet and following poetic custom that dates back all the way to the Jahiliyyah, the period of pre-Islam, bemoans the loss of youth and man's powerless in the hands of fate. I'm just going to read a couple of lines in English and I'll come back later to it. And again, for those of you who know Arabic poetry well, they're quite generic. There's nothing unusual about them, and they're quite banal in some ways. In the days of my youth, my soul obtained whatever it desired. Now old age has brought it its warnings. Indeed, it has been struck by the arrows of passion, which have divided up their portions. Fortune has not sown its seeds on fertile ground for me, nor has it reaped its fruits. And then line 4, the last line of the gnomic introduction, he writes, and again, having interjected his own first-person voice into the poem, I exhausted all my energies for war, and I have prepared to bear the burdens of peace. And again, this is a very reflective, these lines are very reflective of his own life experiences, and I'll come back to that. Line 5, which begins the new segment of the poem, begins with the word kumait. And the word kumait in Arabic means dark red or chestnut red, and it as an adjective, and as a noun, it refers to a very dark stallion, a reddish brown stallion, or a very rich and robust wine. So you can see now the transition that he's using, again, from war, the image of war and peace, and now he's going to segue into the poem. I'm going to read the Arabic for those of you who know Arabic, because the punning in the Arabic is quite brilliant. First, I'll read out the English, and then I'll read the Arabic following. Red dark wine, like the chestnut-colored stallion, makes the imbiber spirited with a youthful vigor whenever he partakes in round after round. The cup ladles out the wine as it gushes from its jug, and you imagine it to be the stallion's corral. So again, he's using the dual images or the dual meanings of kumait to bring this, to segue into the next segment. Allow me to read the Arabic, the 2 lines. Kumaitun laha marahun bil fata إذا حث باللحو أدوارها تناولها القوب من دنها فتحسبه كان مدمارها. So again, you see the horse and the wine. The segment adheres to the expectations of the wine song and its descriptions of the fine qualities of the grape and the vintage. It describes the venue and occasion of celebration. And here it's a nocturnal visit to a convent for an evening of celebration. It introduces a cast of characters, the young female server of the wine, the abbess who greets and sells the wine, a band of young noblemen, brave warriors by day and jovial boon companions by night, and what I'm going to call geisha girls, and I'll come back to that word a little bit later. This in Arabic is qayna and qiyan. It's one of the 5 categories of slave girls as delineated by al-Jabbar, but they're a very special kind of a slave girl, very close sociologically and aesthetically and culturally to the Japanese geisha. That's why I like to use the word geisha here. These are the women. They are musicians and singers and dancers who provide the entertainment. But once again in the segment, the poet will inject his own personal voice as he describes it. So I've done here, out of these lines, I've picked out about 11 lines, and I'm going to read them to you in English to give you a flavor, if you'd like, of the festivities that is taking place. First the English and then the Arabic. A young water girl, palms stretched out, clutching with her fingers the neck of the wine jug. A cloistered nun unlocks her abbey, and we were her visitors for the night. It was as though the musk sacks on her were 2 earthen jugs whose pitch was buried within. I placed my silver coins on her scale, and she poured out for me the jug, poured out from her jug her solid gold. We offered betrothal to 4 of her daughters so that pleasure may deflower the innocence. And here, let me interject here by underlining the word benat, the bint of the karam, which is the fine grape. It's the mature grape, and it's also here, he's punning between the grape and the beloved. Again, let me read that line. We offered betrothal to 4 of her daughters so that pleasure may deflower their innocence. And then I jump a little bit later. The songstresses strumming their instruments have silenced the movements of distress. The one wraps her arms around the neck of her lute. Another one kisses her flute. A dancing girl stretches her leg the extent of a hand and taps at her tambourine. Small scraps of the yellow wax candles show you the blossoms from their light. And from above the columns is darkness tearing off the veils with the light. And we imagine that we master our destinies, but the darkness extinguishes their lives. For those of you who read Arabic, you will see that I've taken some liberties here, quite a number of liberties in my translation. But I will read now the Arabic. And again, you'll notice the short meters and the beautiful rhyming that can almost be imagined that this segment, which echoes a ghazal, an Arabic ghazal, as well as being the khamriya, gives you a sense of the musicality and the festivity of the occasion. Here is the Arabic. وَسَاقِيَةً زَرَرَتْ كَفَّهَا عَلَى عُنْقِ الظَّبِّ أَزْرَارَهَا وَرَاحِبَةٌ أَغْلَقَتْ دَيْرَهَا فَكُنَّ مَعَ اللَّيْلِ زُوَارَهَا كَأَنَّ نوافجها عندها دناني مدنمة قارها ترحت بميزانها درهمي فأجرت من الدن دينارها خطبنا بنات لها 4 ليفترع اللحو أبكارها وقد سكنت حركات الأسى قيان تحرك أوتارها فهذه تعانق عودها وتلك تقبل مزمارها وراقصة لفظت رجلها حساب يد نقرت طارها فقضب من الشمع مصفرة تريك من النار نوارها وتكل الدياج على هامها وتهتك بالنور أستارها كأن نسلط أجالها عليها فتمحق أعمارها. The last two lines conjure the images of candles burning out as the night of inebriation, as I read it, dissolves into a morning of sobriety, allowing the poet to shift the theme and the mood of the poem to the third and final segment. And allow me here to just interject by saying that in reading many of the poems of Ibn Hamdis, this is a favored trope of his. It's not the only one. He didn't invent it, but he uses it much in his poetry, of this idea of a night of inebriation moving off into the morning of sobriety, of reality, and of battle. In other places, I would read this as a way of connecting the classical nasib, or the amatory preface, and the extended ghazal with the tardiya, with the hunt, with the rahil, and on into battle. But that's something for literary historians that we can talk about a little bit later. The final segment of the poem is 6 lines in which the poet, and as I mentioned before, has taken every advantage in his Diwan, whether in reciting a panegyric to a king or an illustrious businessman, as he has done, in which he reminds his audiences of his exile from Sicily. And part of that, the poetics of his reading his exile, is a remembrance of lost youth. And these 6 lines are often quoted in medieval anthologies, later anthologies of Ibn Hamdis, 12th and 13th centuries, in which for which he is best known. So what I'm going to conclude here before my big conclusion, my final reading of these 6 lines, and then I'm going to read the Arabic. And again, thinking about what just transpired, a night of partying, of wine, women, and song, you'll notice the shift now changes quite dramatically. I remember Sicily as agony steers in my soul all remembrances of her. An abode for the pleasures of my youth that has been abandoned, where once inhabited by the noblest of people. For I have been vanished from paradise, and I long to tell you its story. Were it not for the saltiness of tears, I would imagine my tears as her rivers. I laughed at 20 years old out of youthful passion. Now at 60, I cry for her crimes. Do not exacerbate my faults on your own account, since God has already forgiven them. ذكرت السقلية والأسى يهيج للنفس تذكارها ومنزلة للتصابي خلت وكان بنو ظرف عمارها فإن كنت أخرجت من جنة فإني أحدث أخبارها ولولا ملوحة ماء البكا لخلت دموعي أنهارها ضحكت ابن 20 من صبوة بقيت ابن 60 أوزارها فلا تعظمنا لديك الذنوب فما زال ربك غفارها. So that is the poem, and I'd like to just stop here and suggest how we may read this. And then I will open it up to the questions. I believe there'll be lots of questions, but I just want to contextualize this poem. For those, there are 2 ways to read this poem. On the surface, one could read it as being an exercise in classical Arabic poetry. And here I think of less the Jahiliyyah period, the real classical period, but the neoclassical poetry that was much in vogue, I'm going to say, in the post-Mutanabi period. It's worth remembering that poets of Al-Andalus, of medieval Spain and Sicily, were more orthodox than the poets from the East. As much as there were some kinds of poetic innovations, the real serious poets tried to emulate the great classics of the East. And what we see here is a real faithful reading to the canons of classical Arabic in this poem. So if one, outside of the mention of Sicily, of the word Sicily here, one could possibly read this as a poem that, that is very much within the traditions, if you'd like, of neoclassicism. Secondly, the poem is important, or should be read in its meaning in the context, in two external contexts. First, in the context of what was going on in the ground in later Western Mediterranean, from the central to the Western Mediterranean, both in Muslim Sicily, that was being taken over by the Normans from the Italian mainland, and in Spain, much more known, that was taken by the Christian reconquest. So he lived through the ravages of these conquests, both in Sicily and in Spain, and thinking about this poem in a way reminds us of the idea of having a youthful bliss, whether it's literal or not, whether Ibn Hamdis drank wine or not. That's something that poets and students have argued about for years. But again, the conventions of poetry allow him to remember a homeland that was green of pastures, that was cross-cultural, that was tolerant, that was a youthful paradise. And then thirdly, and this is something that is a little bit more controversial, and we don't have a lot of record about this, I'm reading this particular poem and the sequencing of the three movements of the amateur, of the gnomic introduction, and then of the wine song, and then of Sicily, as a way of responding to what was going on, particularly in Spain, but somewhat in North Africa, of the rise of the Almoravid movements and a fundamentalist movement of what was going on in Islam in the period of Western Islam. And we do know that when the Almoravids, who helped Seville in the Battle of Zalaca in 1086, in 1086, they came back and they wiped out the Abbadids in Seville because they felt them to be too worldly, too dunyawi, if I can use this particular word. There was too much of wine and celebration, and there wasn't enough of fundamentalist Islam. And I can't help but read that Ibn Hamdis at this particular time is responding not only to his own exile, but also to what was going on in terms of the loss of Muslim Sicily, the loss of Arabic culture, particularly the secular humanist aspects of Arabic poetry that he saw first in Seville and he's seeing now in North Africa. And I will, so I think again that the odd choice, and again, using God, evoking God, and God is the forgiver, and the idea of the noob is something, again, that it's a very interesting way to end this particular poem. So what we see in this qasida, in this 37 years of qasida, is a lot of emotion. There's a lot of autobiographical information going on. There's a lot of convention, poetic convention, and also a worldliness, if I can use Edward Said's term, of the worldliness of the text in which we read this particular poem at a time of rapid changes, but a time of not only exile from a homeland, but exile from a time of Arabic poetics, in which there was as I say before, I insist on this, and I've gotten in trouble before, but a way of poeticizing a kind of a secular humanism that was part and parcel of Arabic poetry at the time. So I'm going to stop there, and I think I probably are a little bit shorter, but I would love to open it up to questions at this particular time.
Any questions? You can write in the chat also.
Should I look at the chat and see?
I'll read the questions for you.
No. Okay. If I could just come in here for a second. I chose this poem as well because this is something that is always intriguing audiences. This question of wine and the role of the wine song. And this is, the wine song has been often evoked in panegyric poetry in which the boon companions of the leader, whether they're on a day of jihad or they're fighting a battle or they're doing whatever they're doing. At night, there was a celebration of male bonding, and it was done over wine, and it was done with, eventually in time, it brought in music, it brought in other kinds of celebration. Again, the image of wine, or the metaphor of wine, not only comes into the harbiya, that is the war song and the wine song that comes into the poem, but wine as a metaphor, and wine as an extended metaphor, came into Sufi poetry as well. So we mustn't, as readers of Arabic poetry, read too literally into the idea that what's going on here in wine is a sin against Islam. It wasn't meant that way. It wasn't read that way, and it wasn't meant that way. We have to think of it as the metaphor, and we have to think of it of its long uses in Arabic poetry. Suzanne Stakiewicz has suggested that wine is like blood. It's a bonding between people. So to a medieval Muslim or medieval Arab, whether he's in Palermo or in Seville or probably in Cairo or Alexandria, this would not be disturbing. This would not disturb an audience of Arabic poets at the time. Even though today I often get people saying, why is he writing about wine when he's a Muslim? Isn't there some kind of a disconnect? And in the realm of poetry, Arabs understood that this was poetry. And these were conventions, and these were tropes, and these had metaphoric meaning. So I just wanted to bring that out.
All right. We have comment and questions from Kimberly. She said, thank you for your lecture. It was incredible, and your New York accent is great.
That's a one major correction. I am a Bostonian. That's in New England. It's not New York.
Yes, that's right.
There you go.
It's very clear in that the translation of these portions of poem took a ton of time, especially translating it so that people of the present day can feel and understand them. And translating them, how many times did you revise? What was the role of history, and how did your knowledge of the history affect your choices of words? Were there any times that you changed a word because of the history or not?
Okay. Wonderful set of questions. I revised them many times. I even had my late colleague, my wonderful late colleague, Wolfhard Heinrich, used to love for me to give him some of the difficult lines, and he would spend days and days on them and come back and say, I don't know what's going on here. My friend Gabor Asfour in Egypt, when he was here in Harvard, I used to give him some of these poems to read. Ibn Hamdis was famous or notorious for using very strange metaphors and for using words in places that weren't necessarily used. So there has been, even in the classical tradition and the philological tradition, some contestation about what exactly he meant. I needed to use, in many instances, my knowledge of the history of Muslim Sicily to figure out what was going on in some of these cases. He was massively well-read in poetry. And in my book, I mentioned the fact that there's just tremendous intertextuality with poets, not only pre-Islamic poets, but the neoclassical poets as well. He also has a tremendous historical consciousness. He talks a lot about ancient Near Eastern civilizations, Hebrew Bible, the Zoroastrians, the Sasanians, et cetera, et cetera. And in cases where I wasn't sure, or where I asked and there wasn't a clear answer or an opinion on a line or a verse or some kind of a metaphor, I just poetic license, and I translated it because after a while, after reading hundreds of his poets, I felt that I got to know the guy pretty well. So I took advantage of that knowledge, if you'd like, of knowing the poet by inserting my own poem. You'll notice, by the way, that my English is not beautiful, and that I do not attempt to render the English, to render the poetry into a kind of a Shakespearean or a Miltonian kind of English. I'm like Nabokov. Nabokov said, I want to smell the original. I'm not interested in hearing from the translator. I want to hear as close as I can to the original author. So I've taken a Nabokovian, if I may say that, approach to my translation, and I'm trying to give the most literal sense, or at least what I think he's trying to say to the audience. There are times when I came back to poems that I've worked on. I first started doing this seriously during a sabbatical in Rome, where I finally got to see the first manuscript in 2004, and I did a lot of my first translations there. 15 years later, I came back to my translations, and it's like, my God, what was I thinking? You know, I mean, it just wasn't there. So I have to constantly rethink about this, revise it. I've often been I fell into the habit of misreading things, and sometimes I read words or phrases in with different translations. So your series of questions are quite apropos. So thank you. There's a question I have here. Should I read it, Abir? Is it okay as I see?
Yes, and everybody can hear it. The other question from Initial AM, which poets, if any, were influenced by Ibn Hamdis among the early Italian French traveling poets?
I venture to say that there are not many. And this is a big, huge question. When at the time of when Arabic poetry, and my first book, there's a last chapter on that, on the panegyrics to the Normans. By the time the vernacular poetry in Sicily, in Italian, came in with the court of Frederick II, La Scuola Siciliana, there is very little influence, or we have very little textual traces, footprints, if you'd like, of actual prints. So we don't know to what extent later poets and Italian poets were influenced by him. Unlike some of the poets of medieval Spain, which use bilingualism, the kharjas and things of that nature, the muwashah, and the Ibn Hamdis was solidly classical Arabic and neoclassical Arabic. So when he was reading his poetry, when he was writing his poetry, whoever were the Arabists who were working in the Norman courts would probably have a very difficult time reading it unless they had years and years of training in classical Arabic. His influences come way back. He's got lots of references to Imrul Qais and Antara, of all the Jahiliyyah poets. He has influences, especially of a Mutanebi, and we all know in literary history that once Mutanebi came onto the radar screen, the poetic radar screen, he was probably the most influential and had the most impact of Arabic poetry at the time. Abu Tamam, a lot of the neo-poets, there's interaction with or intertextuality with Bohtari, et cetera, et cetera. But even in Spain, when he was in Spain, there are no traces of Ibn Hamdis being involved in or dabbling in these faddish poems that kind of work towards the vernacular, like the muwashah, like the zajal. He had no reason for that. I have a theory for that. I think that Ibn Hamdis wanted to memorialize Muslim Sicily in the Arabic canons, and he stuck to the more traditional forms.
We have a question from Rebecca. She actually has two parts. One, would Ibn Hamdis have known Ibn Hazm and the exiled poet of, or the exile poetry of Ibn Zaydun. I'm curious if there's an overlap.
Well, yeah, it's interesting that when Ibn Hamdis, there's a wonderful story about him that he after an arduous journey across the North African desert, and he crossed what is the very treacherous, the Straits of Gibraltar. For those of you who've ever been on a ship, that's not a mild visit. That's a very rough waters. When he landed in the Iberian Peninsula, he made his way up into Seville, and he wasn't given an audience, and he was despaired. There's an anecdote and there's a poem about this in the Diwan, in which he was going to pack up his bags and go back to North Africa. He chose the court of the Abadid al-Mu'tamid in Seville because the prince himself was a poet, and he brought into his court lots of the best poets in Spain at the time. And these were poets. These weren't religious poets. These were real hardcore classical professional poets. So during his 13-year period, and some of his greatest, Ibn Labana is probably his most important poet. He did get involved with these poets. He did communicate and rival with many of the best poets. Remember, these guys were always rivaling each other as well. They wanted to get money. They were hired hands to sing the praises of these princes who were seeking legitimacy, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no doubt that he knew what was going on. He came to Seville at a time when the Caliphate of Cordoba had already fallen, and Cordoba was, by this point, a memory site, if you'd like, for Arab grandeur. So Cordoba for him was something like Palermo and Sicily as well. This idea that these were golden ages of Arabic culture that were now fading. They were fading with Berbers, they were fading with fundamentalist Muslims, and he was a poet, I think, who wanted to not only memorialize, but to try to save and safeguard Arabic Islamic civilization as he knew it, as it was, and at the same time as it was slipping away. But there's no doubt that he knew who these people were.
And Rebecca has a follow-up question to response to Kimberly's question. Do you feel that Ibn Hamdi's strange metaphors had a particular influence in any future poetry in the Arabic-speaking areas of the Mediterranean? I'm thinking of Ibn Arabi, but he is a few generations later.
Yeah. Well, again, as my late colleague and mentor, Professor Heinrichs, used to say, these Maghribis, I don't understand what they're writing. There is some difference, if you'd like, and I guess native Arabs would know this better than I, that there is a certain kind of a usage of Arabic in the Maghrib that is quite different from, that is from the Mashriq. There is certain kinds of localisms, but again, because Ibn Hamdis was so obsessed with the canons, and because he avoided any of this faddish kind of poetry and vernacular that was going on, his poetry is much more legible. It's much more widely used. So he's not a very good example. We know, for instance, from other texts, from philological texts, Ibn Mekki's treatise on linguistics, that Sicilian Arabic is very close to Maltese. People have talked about being close to Maltese Arabic. But Ibn Hamdis, again, was by the books. He was very much obsessed with the canons. So to what extent he personally influenced later generations of poets, we don't have a paper trail on this.
We have
or at least I haven't followed that paper trail, so I can't answer that.
We have a question from Ali. Do you find similarities between this poem and the poems of the poet Abu Nawas? Abu Nawas was well known as the poet that portrayed wine and khamra as a living human and enjoyed pouring poems about them or about it. And was considered as representative of a movement of modern poetry in his time, or at his time?
Again, that's a superb question. Ibn Hamdis, by the way, has a very good poem in which he talks about al-Hakami. He talks about Abu Nuwas, and he emulates Abu Nuwas's poem that says, why do you want to write about the ancient ruins and sand and things of this nature and camels when you have wine? And what Ibn Hamdis does in one of his panegyrics is to evoke and take it on as well. Abu Nuwas was influential on Ibn Hamdis in terms of specific metaphors, like the vintage of the wine, the colors of the wine, the bubbles that follow down, and the wine and the water, things of this nature. Ibn Hamdis was a gentleman where Abu Nuwas was a bit naughty, if I can jump out of the textual history here. Ibn Hamdis was a well-mannered man. He never did anything naughty, even though this poem has lots of phallic symbols going on, but they're not as bad as Abu Nuwas. There's none of this, altar boys and, all this kind of stuff that's going on. So I would say that Ibn Hamdis was a bit more, not only poetically conservative, but he was also socially conservative. Having said that, and there's lots and lots of jihad in his poetry, but the jihad is targeted against Muslims who are not fighting the Christian reconquest. We don't see much of theological Islam in Ibn Hamdis. That's why I insist on using the word secular humanists, even though I stir the rage of some of my colleagues today on using that. So he does, because Abu Nuwas was so rich in his metaphors of wine, that impacted him. But this idea of getting drunk and I mean, as I said before, Ibn Hamdis was more polite. He was more measured. I hope I answered that question properly.
And we have a question from Jonas. Many thanks for a delightful talk, Professor Granara. I was wondering if you could talk more on the transmission of Ibn Hamdis' corpus. You mentioned it's inclusive and anthologies and the existence of manuscripts at the Vatican and Russian.
Yeah.
Do we have more information about that? How his Diwans traveled throughout the ages? Who may have been invested in them intellectually or otherwise?
Yeah, that's a technical question. I never had the chance to go to St. Petersburg and see the second manuscript. In the Vatican manuscript, there were a lot of colophons, and I was able to trace through the colophons that this manuscript went into the hands of several different people. And there are colophons that were written in Latin, and I had to get a priest because the Latin script was the medieval Latin script was so difficult. I had to get a priest who was sitting near me to transcribe it for me. But there was also an owner of the manuscript in Cairo. So the manuscript had traveled quite a bit. And I think that Ibn Hamdis was much more interesting to philologists and grammarians than he was to other poets. There's not a lot of, he's not a Abu Tamam, he's not a Bukhtari, he's not a Mutanabbi in that sense. I mean, Arabs have very, very discerning taste in poetry. And Ibn Hamdis wrote a lot, and he was a wordsmith, he had lots of things, but he was never really considered one of the greats in Arabic poetry, one of the people who made a lot of change in the poetics of this. But his work, especially, he's cited in poetry for his usage of words, for his obscure meanings and things of that nature. So I believe that Ibn Hamdis let's call it, once the Diwan was put into text, was collated and it disseminated, it was probably more of interest to, as I say, philologists and grammarians and historians of the language than it was to poets. He's not, I even have, I won't mention names. I know people, Arab intellectuals, my many travels have said, why are you working on him? He's not a great poet. We have other poets who are better. And I agree. But that's not what drew me to Ibn Hamdis. What drew me to him is his passion for a place and in a time, and the autobiographical voice that goes into the crafting of his poem. He was a Sicilian loyalist. He was a pan-Arabist. I say these words and people say you can't use that because we don't have pan-Arabists at that time, but I say we do. So I'm going to break the rules and say that Ibn Hamdis was a Mediterranean. He was a pan-Arabist. He was a pan-Muslim insofar as Sicily is concerned. He was, but above and beyond all of that, he was a poet. He was first and foremost a poet. That's what informed him. He was a poet first, and he was a Sicilian second. And he was an Arab third and a Muslim fourth, et cetera, et cetera. But he was a poet. So his Diwan is full of all kinds of treasures. But again, was he a masnoor or a matbur? If I can use these terms, I'll explain these. There was a category in the medieval Islam in which you were a poet of pure talent, of natural born talent. You had taba, you were matbur, or you were masnoor, or you were a poet of craft. And I must say that he's probably a poet of craft more than he was a poet of matbur. But I'd be willing to, I'm persuaded against that. I see another one. I saw that was from Johannes, and Johannes, we can talk about that again at another time, but I hope I came close to doing this. I would love to go to St. Petersburg and see the other manuscript, but I haven't had, the opportunity has not presented itself. So
yeah, we have a question from Luke. How did the arrival of the al-Muravids affected Arabic poetry in the medieval Islamic Maghreb? Mm-hmm. Did al-Muravid authorities pressured poets to adopt a style and was more in the line of stricter interpretation of Islamic precepts? Sorry.
Yeah, I the interpretation of Islamic precepts. Again, this is a very, very big question. When the Almoravids came slowly up from the Senegalese River, these were Berber tribes who basically were Maliki and Maliki Sunni Muslims, but more fundamentalists at the time. One of the reasons they were successful was the fact that the courts, these courtly petty kingdoms, if you'd like, of Seville were very much in the post Cordoba period. They were worldly. There were bourgeois, and there were wine, and there was all kinds of interesting things that were going on. It was a place of liberal cultural, coexistence with Christians and Jews, and it was something like that. When the Almoravids came in, they brought a very strict interpretation of Islam. So when they first overtook a kingdom, first in North Africa, they settled first in Marrakesh, and then moved up into the northern shores of Morocco and expanded into Spain and went further east into North Africa. Poetry was not their thing. They just fired or they killed off all the court poets, and they were much more interested in patronizing the faqihs, the fuqaha, and the ulama at this particular time. They had no sense of it. But once the Almoravids got into those castles and settled into the comforts of these palaces, of these palatial palaces, their grandchildren, maybe not their sons, but their grandchildren started picking up the poetry. And slowly what we see is Almoravid grandchildren coming back and having a taste for the urbane, having a taste for the Arabic culture that was blossoming, and of which poetry was much a part of it, was coming. But then they had the Almowahids come in after that, and the Almowahids were even more strict than the Almoravids. But what the Almoravids did is they got rid of all of the Christians in North Africa. They restored and they got rid of the Shiites in North Africa, and they restored Sunni Islam to the Maliki place. So in one level, what we see the Almoravids doing is as a restoration of Sunni Islam, but at the same time getting rid of the Normans and getting rid of the Christians, et cetera, et cetera. So there was military successes that was there. But even then, the Almoravids, once they come into power, once they're, they like fine architecture, they like, the fine things in life, and poetry became part of it. But again, for these people, for these rulers, for these dynasties, it was really legal questions and sharia and fiqh and things of that nature that drew their attention more than, it was more the deen than the dunya, so to speak. So poetry, in some ways, kind of took a back seat in this particular period of time. And as we know, in Spain and in Sicily, ultimately these beautiful poems and the seeds of poetics that the Arabs planted in Spain and Sicily, ultimately they died out in Arabic, if you will, but they grew up in the troubadours. They came in with the troubadours. So coming back, what we see is that the Arabic aesthetics, the Arabic love of poetry, the culture of poetry would eventually transform itself into the vernaculars of Southern Europe. This is very controversial, by the way, and our Romance language people are still not convinced. They want a paper trail, so that's my answer to that question.
I have a question. What aspects of the Arab culture that was prevailing in the time of Ibn Hamdis in Sicily? And was he mentioning other aspects of the culture? And I would like to know a little bit about his personal life.
Yeah. Well, again, really interesting questions. What we know of Sicily at the time, there was a court in Palermo by the Kelbid. This was a dynasty of the Kelbid court. They did promote poets. There was poetry going on. There was lots and lots of Arab intellectuals at that time going east on a rihla. So we know that the maqama had started to make its way into Sicily. We know that adab and prose writings, we know that the later generations of Muslims in Palermo had read al-Jabbar. So Palermo had become, in effect, like Cordoba, it had become an international center for Arabic learning, broadly defined. And Arabic learning included the many the funun of the religious sciences, and then the secular sciences as well.
Would you consider the court being the poet salon?
The courts were the patrons of poetry, at least in these periods. So they drew them because poets have to live. There's not a lot of money in poetry. And for those of us who write short stories and poetry, there's not a whole lot of money in being a writer. So poets had to live and they wanted to be famous. So much of their fame hinged on their ability to write panegyrics, but they also wrote other things as well. We don't know anything about Ibn Hamdis's formal education. I surmise in his poetry a vast amount of knowledge that came from somewhere, but we don't have a real specifics on where he studied in school. I don't even know if he ever went to the mosque and prayed 5 times a day. Did he keep Ramadan? There's nothing like this available. In terms of his family, he lived in a household that was his mother died when he was young, he and his little sister, and they were moved in with the grandfather. And the grandfather and his aunt, who also had a son and a daughter, and both boys and both girls married, as was the custom of the time. He had children later on in life, but in his later years, when he post 60 years old in his last years, as he's writing frantically to Muslims to join in a jihad to fight off the Normans and save Sicily from Christendom, or from the kuffar, or whatever words he used. There were also pangs of guilt because he was an absentee father. He was not there for the family. And again, this is one of the eternal struggles of the man and the mission. Mahatma Gandhi was a great person to talk about this in his autobiography, talking about what a miserable husband and a father he was, but India was his nation. And in a sense, with Ibn Hamdis, he was of that ilk. He was a professional poet. He was devoted to his craft. And at the same time, he was devoted to Sicily. So in his later years, and he mentions in this poem that I talked about, the way of God forgiven your Dhanub, his old age would be racked with guilt. And part of that guilt is perhaps writing about wine, women, and song, and also about abandoning his family. So one would say that he wasn't a family man in that way. He did have a slave girl named Jawhara who drowned in the Mediterranean when they were moving back from Iberian Peninsula, back from Spain to North Africa. And he has two short poems of them. They've been cut off, in which he's quite affectionate for her and writes about her. And he has an elegy to a daughter at the later year of his life. His elegies to his daughter, to his father, and his personal family are quite wonderful. There's quite a bit of emotion there and passion as well. So it is in the poetry and in the biographical voice of the poetry that we extract this information. Otherwise, there's no information about his family outside of what's in the poems. So, I mean, this guy must have gotten up early in the morning every day and went to his desk and wrote his poetry. And where he was lucky, he was able to perform it in public. There's one poem he has when he's in a big audience, and he's got a 78-line poem, and it's a panegyric to the new Zirid prince in Mahdia, North Africa. And right in the middle of the poem, right in line 54 to 60, whatever the line is, he just jumps out and he starts ranting about Sicily, about the Muslims of Sicily who were lighting bonfires of fitna, you know, while the ravages of the Normans were coming in. And at the same time, while he's writing in his later years, you have Arab Muslims in Palermo writing panegyrics to Roger II. So the world is changing, and his angst is directed not only against divisive Arabs, but also corroborating Arabs and Arabs and Muslims who were living in the new world, the new world order. So he's writing at a time of massive changes across the Mediterranean, and it's all done in poetry. We don't have any letters that he wrote. There is an exchange of letters with Mu'tamid, but they're all done in verse. We have no you know, nothing else, nothing external, no correspondence other than his poems.
Do we have any other questions before we conclude? Well, I would like to thank Dr. Granara for this beautiful presentation and for giving us an insight to Ibn Hamdis and his poetry. And I would like to thank our attendees for making it to our third Poetry and Prose event of the year. And I would like to remind everybody that his latest book is available at the library and SQCC. You can check it out, and also you can purchase it on Amazon. And we provided the link in the chat, in the top of the chat.
May I also just take the last 60 seconds and thank you, Abir, for the invitation. I'm also honored. I see some very eminent scholars of Arabic, Shukri and Muhammad, to name a few. I thank you. I'm honored that you were here today. This is a wonderful audience. The questions were absolutely amazing, and happy reading to all. Arabic poetry is something else, and I hope you all get more and more involved in it. Anyway.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.